So this talk, as you just heard, draws upon my book, Orca, a study of the changing relationship between humans and killer whales, especially in this region, the Pacific coast, but really around the world. It sort of touches upon those relations around the world. Now, for many here, for many on the West Coast, this concern, this interest in orcas, I think, probably seems natural. It seems like most people should just be obsessed with orcas, enough to spend 7 or 8 years of one's life and write a book about them. After all, we're surrounded by images, and I just wanted to give you a little peek. And a lot of these are from the Vancouver Island, but also the Puget Sound area and here. And so just wanted to give you a little reminder of how often we see these images and perhaps pass right by them without noticing. So this is outside the Empress and Victoria. From Orca Airways, Ltd. This one's from Washington State Ferries, because orcas carefully wash their hands apparently, and so they have hand sanitizer. Orca Books, that's in Olympia, Washington, the capital of Washington. Got Orca Electronics. It just keeps going. This is maybe my favorite, right? Because several subpopulations do have dental problems, especially the ones that eat sleeper sharks. So Orca Family Dental made sense. This is, as I recall, I think this is Seattle Aquarium's Orca trading cards. With the popular names as well as the alphanumeric designations. We all know, for example, that orcas love coffee, and so we've got coffee and to relax in the evening. We've got Orca wine. My personal favorite, this used to be sold on the Coho at Black Ball Ferries between Port Angeles and Victoria. Can't find it anymore, but don't knock it. Give it a chance. It's delightful. Took me a while to convince my sons to try it, but they've ended up loving it. So just to give you a sense of I mean, and these are just little bits, but how ubiquitous the idea and the images and our attention to orcas are, especially on the West Coast here. Well, this iconic status certainly played a role in convincing me to write this book. I came back, as you just heard, in 2007 and was surrounded by this, and certainly that was part of the spark. And also playing a role were the charged debates that we're building around the species, but around sort of environmental damage and infrastructure projects, in the last 10 to 15 years in our area, the debate over the expansion of the pipeline, more broadly environmental damage. The future of captivity, is a debate that is charged here, but well beyond the West Coast. So lots of reasons, but I also had very personal reasons for writing this book, and it's quite an unusual history book this way, for having sort of aspects of personal connections. In the 1970s, my father helped capture orcas on both sides of the border. In fact, the only figure I found in this story that took part in both sides of the border. It's why I was born in Victoria. And during my childhood, after he had left this industry and he was doing other things, especially commercial fishing, talking about the late 70s and especially the 80s and early 90s, I watched him wrestle with the meaning and the guilt of that past, of having played that role, especially as killer whales became increasingly iconic on the West Coast. And that was, I want to emphasize, before the documentary Blackfish in 2013 focused millions, not just in our region, but really around the world, especially running on CNN as often as it did, millions around the world on the topic of captivity, marine mammal captivity, and particularly orca captivity. Today, as these images show, and I think I don't need to convince anyone here, even though I know that environmental history isn't always what a local historical society has talks on. I probably don't need to convince anyone here that orcas are central to our region, our transnational region's identity, culture, certainly the tourist industry. The historically most important and historically the most frequently seen, at least in over the last 70 years, population of orcas in our region, the southern residents, are without question the most studied population of cetaceans in human history. They have also, I'm going to argue here, hopefully persuasively, that they have been the most influential on our environmental politics of any population of cetaceans. And despite that, or perhaps because of that role they played in our lives, in our history, in our culture, in our shifting environmental values, they are on their way to extinction. And I'll circle back to perhaps the price they've paid for our education kind of at the end. But at the beginning, I set out, I guess I'm trying to say, I set out to make sense of how we got here. How did we get to this point where these images are ubiquitous? Because it's a relatively recent thing. This hasn't always been the way it was. Why and how did we go from fearing, which we were quite recently, fearing, to loving this apex predator so quickly? What does it say about them, their unique characteristics and such, certainly, but also what does it say about us and what we've valued and how we've changed, our shared past and our shared, hopefully, future with them? What can we learn from this? Now, I'm going to make the argument here, somewhat controversially or boldly, that the pivotal step in this process of us shifting our view of this apex predator was us coming to view orcas as individuals, not as sort of interchangeable, faceless, nameless, masses of black and white flesh with big pointy teeth, but actually as individuals with their own connections, their own families, and even their own potential relations with us. And the driving force of that change, as hard as it is to hear and even contemplate now, because it is so roundly condemned, but the driving force of that change historically was captivity itself, which transformed popular and scientific, and I really want to emphasize that, scientific views of the species from the fearsome killer to the lovable orca, or as some friends who mock my interest in whales tell me, the sea pandas that you study. So let's step back and think about how we and humans actually around the world used to think about this apex predator. For centuries, it was the maritime industries, such as whaling, fishing, sealing, that had shaped popular views of marine predators, period, but certainly of Orcinus orca, the apex predator of the seas. Now, I know that it's very popular, and people often come up to me after talks, why do you use killer whale so often? It's kind of offensive now. We prefer orca, and I sort of like to say, thank you for that, and remind them that, one of the reasons we use orca so often now is because people have forgotten their Latin, because orca, Orcinus orca, can be translated as demon from the netherworld or demon from hell. I tend to think actually killer whale is probably, more complimentary than that. But I do use them interchangeably. Now, the men, almost entirely men who worked the sea in the last 400 or 500 years, the Atlantic, parts of the Pacific, they referred to them, and I'm talking especially about Europeans and then European colonial settlers, referred to them interchangeably as killers and orcas. And I like to emphasize that orca is not a new term. And in fact, orca itself was, until the 1970s, really the more frightening sounding term to people than killer. So it's really orca that's kind of changed its meaning rather than how than us necessarily using that word for the first time. And in fact, both terms in several different languages conjured a predator that didn't just compete with human beings for valuable resources, fish, seals, even other larger whales, but potentially, and according to accounts, frequently, although never confirmed, ate people, killed people. Now, I want to emphasize that's never been the meaning and root of the term killer whale. I mean, so often people said, why do they call them killer whales? They don't kill people. Well, that was never meant to be the meaning. It actually meant killer of whales, right? It was a mistranslation from Spanish and Portuguese. But nonetheless, there was this rumor that they ate people. Writing in the 1870s, U.S. whaling captain Charles Scammon, who was himself legendary for leading the way in nearly eliminating gray whales, Eastern Pacific gray whales, he called orcas, quote, marine beasts who spread terror and death to every ocean. That's called projection, right? For a whaler to say that. Decades later, the director of the Bronx Zoo declared, quote, the killer whale, or orca, is the demon of the seas. On the west coast of Canada and the United States, what became Canada and the United States, Victoria, especially in Victoria, sealers told tales of orcas ramming their sealing vessels and eating men. Now, there was, again, never confirmations, but often in the literature, there seems to be this implication that the only reason that there were never confirmed killings of men who had fallen overboard is because no one survived the encounter. For their part, indigenous peoples in our region, including indigenous whalers, the Chalnoth, the Macaw, sometimes hunted orcas. More often, they'd make use of stranded orcas, but every once in a while, you know, they would go after orcas. They really favored more humpbacks and gray whales for their size and, you know, slower. But a joke that an indigenous interviewee told me was, you know, he said, I'm not sure that they ever really targeted orcas very much, but, you know, when you have a bunch of teenagers who you can't really control, one thing you can do is put them all in a canoe and tell them to go chase the orcas, to go, you know, that'll burn them right out. But in fact, as commercial whaling on this coast developed, you know, beginning in the 1840s really, but then, you know, Yankee whalers and such coming, but then eventually out of, you know, shore whaling in California and then later in Washington, Oregon, and BC. Commercial whalers generally ignored orcas. I mean, they weren't big enough to really yield a lot of oil, and so this is essentially, you know, they essentially see them as a pest predator, you know, a vermin species along the lines of, you know, coyotes and cougars and bears, you know, the kind of animals that threaten humans and threaten human resources, but don't necessarily see them as commercial species. I'll give you a little sense of this, and this is drawn from California, but I think this gives us a good sense. This is a March 1937 headline from the Oakland Tribune. And it reported that killer whales off of the Farallon Islands, which are really, really important seal rookeries, had, quote, slaughtered seals by the scores, and also, quote, attacked a small lighthouse skiff. Now, if you think that fake news is new to our era, you actually you can read through the columns of this newspaper and you will search in vain, as I did, for the actual details about how an orca attacked the lighthouse skiff. And actually, you can see how the sort of game of telephone happened, and, you know, a large male orca going underneath the lighthouse skiff, worrying the men who were aboard that it might tip it over several printings, including showing up in the New York Times, became orca overturns and attacks lighthouse skiff. So again, our malleable times in terms of information are not so different as we think, perhaps. These views of orcas as pests, not resources, remained consistent after World War II. In contrast to Japan and Norway, which actually did target orcas, killed thousands of orcas around the world, BC, as far as I could tell, BC whalers took only one. And this happened in 1955. This is the Coal Harbor, not this Coal Harbor, but the Coal Harbor on the northern side of Vancouver Island. Whaling station that operated for about 20 years after World War II. And this orca was actually taken at the behest of the Walt Disney Corporation that actually contracted those whalers to kill and prepare, salt and prepare an orca for display, not at Disneyland, thankfully, but actually at another exhibition that the Disney Corporation was putting together. So, but it gives you a sense of, you know, how certainly the whalers, you know, had no compunctions about targeting this male orca. By that time, mid-1950s, the perception of orcas as potential man-eaters hadn't diminished, and in fact, one might argue that it had only grown. I'll give you an example. Now, one of my very first book talks, my mom was in the front, and I had to look at my mom and say, Mom, I didn't find this on my own. a friend of mine sent this to me. I promise I wasn't digging through Stag magazine. It's funny how even in your 40s you have to, you know. Now, Stag magazine was a bit of a precursor to Playboy magazine, but at the time in the 1950s, it was more of a men's adventure magazine. And it had, although you can see the, you know, some of the headlines that might have drawn young men to buy this, right? Sexual practices of American women. I don't know if you can see that at the top. The Stag magazine made a habit of having its covers featuring, you know, supposedly dangerous, vicious creatures, you know, attacking men, often strapping, shirtless men, you know, giant squid, crocodiles, lions. This was very common on Stag. And here you have two men on a life raft looking surprisingly healthy and spry, you know, despite being on a life raft, being, you know, catapulted off of the raft by an angry and aggressive orca, presumably, you know, who intends to eat them. So this gives a sense of this. Now, I have no proof of who read this Stag magazine, you know, issue. This comes out in late 1953. But I can hazard a guess that lots of servicemen, especially U.S. servicemen, might have, you know, seen this cover and perhaps even, you know, read some of the article. And so I don't think it's too much of a leap in terms of evidence to conclude that, you know, that this might have played a role in the next set of events that I just want to allude to really quickly here, which is in early 1954, or the spring of 1954, about 5 months after this issue comes out, the government of Iceland approached soldiers and commanders on a NATO base in Iceland, and it was almost entirely U.S. soldiers, bored. It's Iceland, 1954, right? And the Icelandic government asks the commanders on the base, you know, we're really having a problem with these killer whales, these damn blackfish in our waters. They're eating up our herring. You know, our fishing fleet is suffering. That was actually probably more the British fishing fleet that was coming and scooping up the herring, but people love to blame predators. And so these soldiers, you know, their commanders agreed to actually carry out a series of strafing runs, machine gunning the pods of orcas in Icelandic waters. And this takes place, you know, a series of essentially assaults on orcas in the mid-1950s. Naval magazines, you know, write about it, celebrate it. And we don't know exactly, but, you know, the accounts seem to indicate that they likely, you know, strafed machine gun and killed hundreds and hundreds of orcas in the Icelandic waters. Now, those kind of actions, they may seem shocking to us now, but they're hardly surprising. The U.S. Navy Diving Manual, which is really the Bible for divers, not just Navy divers, but commercial and recreational divers, as scuba developed and became accessible and popular. The U.S. Navy Diving Manual described killer whales as, quote, ruthless and ferocious, instructing divers to, quote, get out of the water immediately if one appeared. As one very popular diving writer quipped, quote, there is no treatment for being eaten by the orca except reincarnation. So this is the imagery I really want to establish that we have around the world. It was a quirk of geography, I argue, that made the greater Pacific Northwest, the West Coast, the transnational, as we think about it, West Coast now, made it the crucible of change in this relationship. The region's population centers, one of which we're in right now, the region's population centers sat on Puget Sound, the Strait of Juan de Fuca, the Strait of Georgia. Today, these bodies of water are increasingly known as the Salish Sea. This was also a large portion, not the only part, but the large portion of the main range of what scientists would later label, they had no idea at the time, but would later label southern resident killer whales. 3 pods, J, K, and L, that we now know rely primarily and sometimes predominantly on Chinook salmon for their food. Chinook salmon that are, of course, produced in this region's rivers, really from northern California to about halfway up Vancouver Island is kind of their range. As late as 1880, they may have numbered as many as 250, perhaps even 300 individuals. But the spread of dams and industrial fishing, brought falling Chinook runs, and certainly hampered the population. And this happened, and I should also say, mining that remade a lot of the watersheds, especially the Sacramento watershed with the gold rush and such. All of this change, especially sort of moving south, from Northern California up through Oregon, the industrial fishing in the Columbia River and such, all of this likely drove the southern residents to spend more and more time foraging in the Salish Sea. Right? The Fraser River, the Duwamish River, these rivers, became more and more important to their food supply. But it's in the Salish Sea, in this more sort of enclosed area, that fishermen, partly because of that kind of often forced intimacy, came to regard them not just as threats to the salmon they were trying to catch, but potentially to their smaller boats and even to themselves. And it's no surprise, in fact, that by the 1890s and 1900s, 1910s, 1920s, stories of fishermen, not just anecdotes, but actually the newspaper stories of fishermen shooting orcas, for sport or out of anger, are quite common. And you can think about it as sort of a piece with the efforts to eliminate seals and sea lions that sort of come after that. For their part, scientists, and there really aren't a lot of scientists focused on marine mammals in North America at the time, but the one lab that was devoted to it was in Seattle, the Seattle Marine Mammal Biological Laboratory. They too viewed orcas primarily as threats to resources. And in particular, they were really interested in orcas, mostly sort of more off coast and in the Alaska waters. Their threats to the northern fur seals, which were a really valuable harvest for the United States government. The United States government, owned Alaska, or purchased Alaska from Russia. One of the resources that paid a lot into the U.S. Treasury was the annual harvest of northern fur seals, tens of thousands that were, harvested, but a lot of them by a private company, but a lot of the money ends up in the U.S. Treasury. And so the interest of marine mammalogists at the time is, let's figure out how many of these seals these killer whales are eating, and how do we stop them from doing this? And so, and when I'm sort of seeming like this is a long time ago, but we're getting a little bit more closer to the present. In fact, through the 1960s, and there's a published study of this. The researchers at that lab, were essentially directed to. And they worked closely with the whaling vessels out of California and such that were operating, and they were directed to harpoon and kill orcas when the opportunity presented itself, just to be able to cut them open and study their stomach contents. I'll just show you a shot of this. This is from sort of the middle northern coast of California. In 1961, the Seattle Times, in fact, celebrated one of these kills a little bit earlier than this, in which the lab's most esteemed scientist, remember this name, we'll come back to him, Victor Sheffer, described orcas in the Seattle Times as, quote, bloodthirsty. So this is one of those kills. There was someone who offered a different view even at this early period. G. Clifford Carl, director of the Royal BC Museum in Victoria, had become interested in orcas, especially after a big stranding had happened right at the end of World War II. And he became especially fascinated with a white orca, apparently an albino orca, that seemed to appear quite a bit in local waters, especially around Vancouver Island. Carl named her Alice. In fact, the first time that we know of that a whale on this coast got named. And he asked lightkeepers and Coast Guard vessels and such to report sightings of Alice. The Victoria Times and the Victoria Colonist and other newspapers noted her whereabouts, reported on that. Some locals made efforts to see her, as you can see here. But despite Carl's investigations, people in the area generally still viewed them as threats, as vermin and such. To give you an idea of this, in 1961, the Department of Fisheries actually, in response to calls from fishing lodges and tourists about the threat of blackfish to the Chinook fishery, to the sport Chinook fishery, actually mounted a machine gun near Campbell River along Seymour Narrows in 1961, just for the express purpose of shooting orcas. Now, it wasn't fired at the orcas. It was fired at cormorants and such, but it wasn't fired at orcas, not because they came to some sort of, crisis of conscience about what they were doing, but that one fairly clear-eyed, administrator asked what I thought should have been the burning question from the beginning, which is, if we're trying to reassure tourists, might it be best if we not fire off a 50 caliber machine gun right where they're fishing? So that's why it doesn't end up getting. But this gives you a sense of the potential, real and potential violence of this kind of mid 20th century period. Now, at the height of that comes the transformation, and it's sparked by capture, live capture. It happens by accident. In the summer of 1964, this is where we get to our even more local connections. The summer of 1964, the Vancouver Aquarium, which was looking essentially for just a model for its to help with a kind of paper mache sculpture in its new foyer, set up an expedition to harpoon a young orca off of East Point, Saturna Island, in order to just use its body, photographs of its body as a model. There's a shot of that moment just before the harpoon is fired and strikes the young orca to the left, right sort of in the base of the skull, but doesn't kill him. Doesn't kill him. And when the whale didn't die, when the orca didn't die, they led it to Vancouver. The animal lived just 2 months, but it shocked everyone. It made an impression on everyone that saw it and those that heard the accounts, especially through its docility. I mean, it didn't seem to be the kind of vicious creature that people assumed that killer whales would be. And in fact, in the kind of charged gender assumptions of the time, many argued the only explanation for this is that it's female, right? That's why it must. And in fact, they end up naming the whale Moby Doll before it's discovered after the young orca's death. It's a male. There's a lot of gender bending that happens in the book, by the way. It was challenging for people to sex killer whales. It sort of plays an interesting role in the story. I have a treat for you here, which is, hopefully this will play, the only color video that exists of Moby Doll. It's silent, but this was taken off of Jericho Beach when it was still an army base. No sound, but get a sense of Moby Doll here. You can already see the sort of skin condition and fin collapse very shortly, and part of that is that the river runoff was so sort of pronounced there that it's actually quite fresh water on the top, and one of the issues clearly became once this young animal died, it's actually the buoyancy was so much less that he was really working hard to, especially with his wound, to swim, and essentially lost strength. I can show you one more shot of here. This is a young trainer doing something nobody could have imagined before, hand feeding this vicious creature, right? And it's sort of impossible for people to imagine at the time. So it's a key moment, but Moby Doll is never displayed at the Vancouver Aquarium, only really displayed for one day, kind of, at the Burrard dry dock. And then dies at the army base, and so the actual kind of public impact is much more limited than it might have been had he lived longer. So really, the key event, much more powerful moment comes south of the border, the Seattle Marine Aquarium, a facility owned by this man, who actually took that video you were just watching, Ted Griffin, a young entrepreneur who had opened this aquarium. And since opening the aquarium in 1962 during the World's Fair in Seattle, he had hoped and really become obsessed with the idea of capturing and what he thought about as befriending a killer whale and swimming with it, had a very romantic sense of this. And he tries many times, but in the summer of 1965, fishermen from Steveston actually, they do what you're not supposed to do, I can tell you as a commercial fisherman, which is they got really liquored up with their nets out still, and they climbed in their bunks while their nets were still out. They woke up to find their nets wrapped around a reef near Namu, BC, and behind that reef, lo and behold, were actually two orcas, trapped but alive. One was a large male, one was a small calf that escaped. The large male they eventually sell to Griffin, who builds a floating containment unit, you can see here, and names the animal after the town where the capture had taken place, Namu, Namu the whale from Namu, BC. And this makes headlines around the world. There's a kind of a month-long or several weeks effort, I should say, to sort of transfer and build the pen, and then about a month-long transport from Namu all the way to Seattle. And when I say it makes headlines, I mean it pushes the Vietnam War off of the headlines of the Seattle Times and Seattle PI. It gets write-ups in Sports Illustrated. I mean, it is a big deal. It's a big story. Reporters ask Griffin, you can see the kind of the excitement here. This is at the Trident Pier, in case you've been to Seattle, you know where that is. Reporters ask Griffin, there's all this excitement, what are you gonna do? You have a killer whale, what are you gonna do? And he says, kind of flippantly, I don't know, maybe I'm gonna swim with it. And they say, no one would be crazy enough to swim with this kind of vicious creature. And in fact, several scientists who were interviewed say, if Griffin jumps into that pool with that killer whale, it'll be the last swim he ever takes. But eventually, Griffin does slip into the water, and lo and behold, Namu, this large male that we now know was probably a teenager, doesn't tear him limb from limb, but actually allows Griffin to be in the water with him, eventually even approach him and touch him, and even ride him. I love to show this picture because when I show this shot, in the context of today, a lot of people are like, well, yeah, obviously that's probably at SeaWorld or something. I'm like, no, this is literally the first images that any human beings on Earth saw, and this is from a very famous National Geographic story that Griffin wrote called Making Friends with a Killer Whale. It comes out in '66. This is the first time people have seen images of a human being swimming with a killer whale. By the way, this never happens in the wild. I mean, I had my publishers ask, they said, what would be really great? Can you just get an underwater shot of a human being who's swimming with a killer whale? I'm like, yeah, that would be great. It doesn't exist anywhere, right? You can't find them. Orcas don't come up in the wild and give you kisses, right? And so this is a photo that in our optic now we tend to think about as like this is the beginning of the dark history of captivity, but at the time this is a pivot point in how people are seeing this previously feared and hated predator. Millions would read about this relationship between Griffin and Namu in that article, National Geographic, and many more would see the fictionalized version of this kind of relationship in the film Namu. How Would You Like to Make a Really Big Friend? Comes out in 1966 by the makers of Flipper. Namu's impact, and he's just in captivity for a year before he dies of pollution in Puget Sound. Namu's impact was twofold. First, the public marveled at his gentleness, right? This it goes a step beyond even the hand feeding you saw there with the trainer in Vancouver. Marveled at his gentleness with Griffin. But second, and this is the double-edged sword here, his popularity, the draw of these shows, and Griffin and Namu were the first to have a sort of a human and orca show in front of people in kind of a circus atmosphere. The popularity of Namu convinced oceanariums, the burgeoning oceanarium industry around the world, that they needed to have one of these. They needed to acquire their own orcas. This is the new bottlenose dolphin that had been sort of the iconic animal for the small aquarium industry prior to this, or the equivalent of elephants for zoos. I mean, you can't be a real zoo, in the 20th century without having elephants. In the following years, especially after Namu's death, Griffin pivoted to businessman and captured and supplied most of these orcas from what we now know was the southern resident population, including SeaWorld's first Shamu, which is actually an adaptation of Namu. When Griffin sold the first whale there, and they asked, "Hey, can we use that name? That's such a big deal now, very famous. Can we use Namu too?" And he said, "No. Well, it's a female. We'll call it her Shamu." So that's where that comes from. Captive orcas drew crowds, giving most visitors, and I can't emphasize this enough because this is before the days of whale watching. This was before almost any live scientific research of whales. I mean, scientists are going on killing and cutting up whales. That's whale science at the time. Captive orcas gives millions of people their very first view of close-up view of cetaceans, and especially their first sense of them as individuals, with personalities, with names, yes. By 1970, so in 1964, when Moby Doll was captured, no one had seen a captive orca close up. By 1970, some 30 million people had seen captive killer whales. And they weren't just spectators, as I just alluded. Many were scientists with their very first live access, or access to, I should say, live orcas, or really live cetaceans, period, of any size. And in the process of studying them close up, their physiology, their diving mechanisms, their acoustic capacity. This is, for example, how scientists proved that orcas use biosonar, just as they had proved in captivity that dolphins do that. In the process, they also came to know captive orcas as individuals with personalities. Now, one of them, what I have argued in other places, is the single most important cetacean in human history, was right here. And that was an individual named Scanna. Anybody remember Scanna? And this is actually a shot of pulse bong with a different orca on the right there, so don't be misled. That's not Scanna. That's actually in Sealand, but you can see Scanna being delivered on the left. Scanna was caught in Puget Sound, 1967, and brought to the Vancouver Aquarium, first displayed at the boat show in a tiny little sort of outdoor-style swimming pool, and then bought by the Vancouver Aquarium in March 1967. And she didn't just draw visitors. This is the first orca on display at the Vancouver Aquarium, but she captivated this young researcher from New Zealand named Paul Spong. Initially, Paul Spong just had a contract with the aquarium to study the dolphins and Scanna's visual acuities, or how well the orcas see under the water and above the water. But, and I'd love to act this out for you, but I'm sort of on camera here, so I can't move around. But so you're gonna have to use your imagination. But the key moment for him, the aha moment, actually came with Scanna challenging his scientific experiment. And I'll just summarize this really quickly. But the visual acuity test was very simple. It was seeing how close two lines could be on a wooden plank before Scanna could no longer distinguish between a single line and those two lines. And so, you would change the distances. You would change the distances between the two lines. And her job was essentially just to use her rostrum to hit a lever. If the single line was on the left, she needed to hit it on the left, and there was a lever on the right. If she did it the right way, she got a half a herring as a reward, right? So it's sort of classic behavioral reward. Well, it takes her a while to figure it out, but pretty soon it starts working, and Paul Spong gets what all scientists desperately want, other than grants, which is data. He gets data, right? Day after day, he's collecting data, he and his research assistant. And then, this is all going routinely, and then one day, Spong is whistling along, walks around the pool, sets up everything, and Scanna comes out, and she seems like she's in a bit of a mood and doesn't really want to do this. And he's sort of trying to get her to do this, and she's, tearing around the pool, she's slapping the water, and then eventually she kind of comes over, it's almost a tantrum, looks like, comes over and starts answering, but she answers wrong. She had been getting about 97% right, and now she answers wrong. And when I say wrong, I mean all wrong. 0 right. Now, in the context of the times, there's no good way to explain that as a scientist, because there was a belief that, that animals basically responded to external stimuli. They wouldn't just get angry and in their different personalities, have a tantrum and refuse to cooperate. But 0% is hard to explain in terms of random, odds. And so this really blows his mind, and he finds himself trying to figure out what the hell's going on with the animal. And, after a couple of days of this not working, he's just sitting there at the BC Tell pool with his socks off, dangling his bare feet in the pool. And Scanna is doing these lazy circles, and he's just sitting there thinking, what the hell's going on with this, with her? What does this mean about this creature I'm studying? And he doesn't, he's lost in his thoughts. And he doesn't notice that Scanna's circles are getting a little wider and a little wider, a little wider. And eventually she goes right past him and opens her mouth and rakes his bare feet with her 50 conical wolf-like teeth. And he says, and I quote, "Ah!" Pulls his feet out. What the hell just happened? And she goes around the circle, and he's like, what is going on? And he does then what I would never have done. He puts his feet back in. And she does the same thing again, and he pulls them out. And they do this 11 times. They just do this dance of teeth and fear. And the 12th turn, he manages to keep his feet in despite the raking, and she stops. And it was at that moment that Dr. Paul Spong realized that she had become the scientist and he the subject of an experiment. And that blows his mind. He's sort of, his professional identity and priorities are really shattered by this. And he goes on, and I'll sort of circle back to him, but he goes on to call for not just study of wild orcas, but the release of captive orcas. The Vancouver Aquarium decides it would rather release him, it fires him. But he does go on to start Orca Lab up in Blackfish Sound and remains a vibrant wild orca researcher to this day. But we'll come back to him and Scanna's impact in a moment, because I want to sort of finish that off. But while this is going on, I guess I should, my little hint is Spong, because of this interaction with Scanna, is going to become a really critical figure in the anti-whaling movement, especially through Greenpeace, which I would argue would not happen without this interaction with Scanna. And so while this is going on, live captures escalate. We're talking about the late 1960s. On the Sunshine Coast, fishermen make 3 captures in the late 60s, including the young orca who had become Corky 2, who's actually still in captivity today since 1969. And in Puget Sound, a pivotal event takes place in August 1970 when Griffin's company unknowingly captures or rounds up all 3 pods, virtually all of the whales of the southern residents, some 90 individuals, off of Whidbey Island in Penn Cove. This is a traumatic moment for the population. By the way, there were no regulations in BC or the United States about protecting them, and so he could have quite legally shot them all. He could have shipped them, to all oceanariums. It was actually a bit of self-regulation that caused him to release most of these, but still, 4 individuals die and 8 are removed, including Tokate, the individual that just recently died in the Miami Sea Aquarium. When the deaths are discovered, the deaths of 4 calves in particular are discovered, the public backlash in Washington State contributes to state regulation, and then also contributes to the U.S. Congress's passage of the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which is one of the most forward-looking, this is 1973, 72, one of the most forward-looking pieces of environmental legislation really in world history. And I would argue that despite all the weirdness of my former country, the United States, Canada doesn't have anything like the Marine Mammal Protection Act and needs it. Regulation, in fact, comes much more slowly in Canada, but Save the Whales movement is emerging in this city, right, that gives birth to Greenpeace. Greenpeace, originally an anti-nuclear organization, but as its turn toward the issue of whaling is closely connected to the Vancouver Aquarium and this experience between Scanna and Paul Spong. After meeting writer Farley Mowat in downtown Vancouver, And he's there in late 72 promoting his book, A Whale for the Killing. Paul Spong realizes that commercial whaling, industrial whaling, is really the great existential threat to whales on Earth. And he lobbies Greenpeace, the Greenpeace organization, to take a look at whaling as an issue that it could dig its teeth into. He invites Greenpeace leader, it's kind of loose to say anybody on Greenpeace was a leader, but the prominent Greenpeace member, Bob Hunter, former reporter in Vancouver, to the Vancouver Aquarium. And he basically says, Bob, I know you guys don't think whaling is important, but come meet Scanna and see if she has an impact on you. So he does. And there's a press conference there, and with the cameras clicking, reporters see a pretty amazing sight. First of all, this is 74 now. Paul Spong hadn't seen Scanna in 5 years, and Scanna sort of comes to the edge of the pool and greets him. And clearly remembers him, and there's quite an emotional reunion between Scanna and Paul Spong. And then Spong tries to get Hunter to come to the side of the pool and say hi to Scanna. And he does what a lot of us would do when they see a predator that size. He's like, I'm fine over here. I'll watch. I'm good. And he said, don't worry, she won't hurt you. Come on over, just come over and touch her. And he comes over, hi, Scanna, very nice. She feels like kind of a wet inner tube. Okay, just very sweet. And then this moment happens. Hunter, gets over the platform and leans down, and Scanna kind of gives him a little kiss. And then Scanna sinks down into the water, and he's watching. And then she rises out of the water with her mouth open and clamps down on his head and holds him there for what he felt like was 30 seconds. It was probably a couple seconds, and then releases him. Now, this is a trained behavior for the show, but regardless, Hunter describes that moment as the combination of dropping LSD and being kicked in the head by a mule. The sort of this mind bomb almost that he talked about, with Greenpeace's actions happens in his own mind. He goes outside the gates of the Vancouver Aquarium and sort of falls to his knees and he's crying. It's sort of this conversion moment. And again, Scanna is playing that role. That role is this of historical agent to transform, not knowing what she's doing, but like so many humans who are historical agents, not knowing what they're doing. But in fact, making this impact on Spong, making this impact on Hunter, they become really the messiahs of the anti-whaling movement, leading Greenpeace in that direction. Iconically, the following year, confronting Soviet whalers off the coast of California and getting precious seconds of video footage that become, in our terms today, viral. Get shown on newsreels. And what made this such an iconic moment is not that it was showing the brutality of a whale hunt. They're hunting sperm whales off the California coast, but the morality of the framing with human beings in it. First of all, this was the first time human beings had seen video. There have been lots of videos of whaling before, but the first time people have seen video of human beings trying to protect whales, trying to stop the whaling, right? Putting their bodies in the way. And second, because of the transformation in the way humans were seeing cetaceans, to a great extent, through actually impact of captive orcas on people, they're now seeing the whales being hunted not as sort of masses of flesh and oil, but as individuals, as families, right? That are being assaulted by these factory ships. Meanwhile, a government researcher in BC, in Nanaimo, was helping to take that change, the seeing, cetaceans as individuals and families, to a whole new level. And he deserves to be celebrated not just as a leading figure in the history of science, in BC, but really the history of marine science more broadly. He hated to be photographed, so there's very few shots of him, but here's one. Michael Bigg, Dr. Michael Bigg, who worked for Fisheries Canada out of Nanaimo, the Pacific Biological Station in Nanaimo. He's very famous now for having sort of cracked the code of being able to identify individuals and their families, and this is how we kind of came to understand and identify pods and communities, and eventually even the matrilineal organization of orcas. Well, a lot of people forget that he got a lot of his start working with captive orcas, really starting to understand their bodies and how to read their bodies and how to view them. it was really working closely, especially with this. You can see a couple shots here. This is a captured orca, but this is Haida and Sealand that he was actually modeling a radio transmitting unit that he was then going to mount on this whale, known as Taku, to be released to see if they could sort of monitor and identify where it was going and such. Big, as he's working with these orcas close up, decides that he thinks it's possible to identify them individually by sight. You don't have to mark them, and there was all kinds of attempts, by the way, during these captures before they released animals. They tried to mark them. They used dry ice branding, like on livestock, to burn marks into them. They talked about using lasers to sort of cut into their flesh to create sort of indelible marks. But Big decides you can do this non-invasively. He decides, they're all pretty unique. The shapes and the cuts and stuff out of their fins stay pretty much the same throughout their lives. They have these pretty unique saddle markings right behind their dorsal fins, and he argues that you can actually identify whales by sight if you have really good photography. Now, this is the model of whale science now, but at the time, people thought he was a kook. And they argued that the only way you can do it is by catching them and marking them. But his system catches on, and it soon allows scientists to decode them, essentially, and to start to understand that we're seeing these same orcas again and again in association with one another. Now, that change is already evident, when the last couple of captures take place in 75 and 76 in BC and in Washington State. You're already seeing people protesting and thinking about these orcas as individuals, as that can't be taken away from their families as early as that. I think that's why when a film comes out in 1977 trying to sort of capitalize on the success of Jaws 2 years before, it doesn't do very well, and it especially doesn't do very well on the West Coast. And this is Orca, killer whale. Richard Harris film, Bo Derek loses her leg to the angry, vengeful orca. It's in some ways it's sort of a more complex movie than you might think when you sort of see clips, because it's really about a moral vendetta an orca has against a fisherman, which sort of shows an orca as a moral animal quite different than Jaws. Having said that, it's definitely an exploitation film, and it didn't do very well because this image of killer whales, and even the use of orca as a scary term, wasn't quite getting traction the way it might have in years previously. In fact, that summer, southern BC, and especially the southern Vancouver Island, but gets covered a lot in Vancouver, was actually focused on an entirely different drama, not the drama of Orca and Bo Derek getting her leg bitten off by the vengeful orca, but in fact, the rescue of a wounded orca calf. In the summer of 77, boaters find a young calf near Campbell River who's been shot, and a young female. And she is rescued. She's trucked down to Victoria and actually recovers in the old saltwater pool of the Oak Bay Beach Hotel, if any of you know that location. And even though she dies a couple of times, meaning her heart stops, they manage to revive her, which helps inspire the name Miracle as she recovers. But that affection, and the affection that people were showing for, Scanna, who lived until 1980 here, and others, that affection hadn't come everywhere in the world. It was still fairly focused, on the West Coast. In 1980, just to give you a sense, the Soviet Union, which was by then the most active whaling nation in the world, reported killing 916 orcas in that year's Antarctic hunt. And of the females they examined, they didn't examine all the females, but of the females they examined, 141 were pregnant. For researchers and orca enthusiasts in the Pacific Northwest, of which there were many by the early 80s, people who had painstakingly studied, identified individual orcas and their family structures, this kind of carnage was unimaginable, right? I mean, this is what happens when you start seeing animals as individuals with families, not just as sort of interchangeable. The next year, Big and other experts, especially from BC, went to the International Whaling Commission's meeting and convinced the nations there to stop the harvesting of orcas, at least until there could be studies of populations. And then, of course, it's the following year, 1982, that the IWC passes the whaling moratorium that's going to go into full effect in 86. I hate to break it to those of you who are Star Trek fans. I had somebody recently tell me, well, obviously it was Star Trek 4 that helped bring about the moratorium, and I said, well, it was a little late to the party, but, great movie, but a little late to the party. By then, by 1982, orcas had already become icons of the West Coast, both sides of the border. Whale watching companies appeared, and officials who had once targeted orcas, scientists who had once targeted orcas, were now charged with protecting them. This is how quickly things had changed. Not just the same places, many of the same scientists. An example of this shift was our old friend, Dr. Victor Sheffer, the one who had in 1961 called orcas bloodthirsty. He too had lived this change. As he reflected in 1994, when asked, how do you explain this? How in less than a quarter of a century, you've gone from this to this. And he said, quote, seeing them in aquariums individualized these creatures, you see. They were no longer just whales in the abstract. Now, when Sheffer was interviewed, 94, the southern resident killer whales were enjoying a recovery, nearly recovering to 100 individuals by the late 1990s. They had been down to about 68 or 69 in the mid-1970s. That trend has not continued, even though captures stopped. The last capture of southern residents was in 1973. Today they number, we think, this is always changing, but maybe 74. And that's a big drop. The past 2 decades, as the human population of the Salish Sea has spiked, southern residents have dwindled. They rely on a dwindling and often endangered and even extinct runs of Chinook salmon. And in fact, one of the reasons why the debate over the Trans Mountain Pipeline going through the Fraser Rivershed was so charged with people that are thinking about southern residents is because the Fraser River is one of their last really reliable sources of Chinook salmon. So many of the others have been depleted, remade, decimated. Chinook salmon themselves are vanishing, and the Canadian government's decision to take on the Trans Mountain Pipeline certainly threatened that. I think that, I said this many times, being interviewed many times over the last 5-6 years. On one level, it was kind of unfair for the Canadian public and the Canadian government to have so much on it about the survival of the southern residents, because of course the Canadian government wasn't responsible for destroying the Sacramento watershed or remaking the Duwamish or remaking the Columbia River. But be that as it may, the Fraser River is a key lifeline for them. And because of that, the debate really raised bigger questions about what we value and how we think about community in this area. Is it just about people? Is it about more broadly the creatures who also make a living here, so to speak, and call this place home? And so I'd like to close with this thought, which is, I think we have to ask ourselves on both sides of the border, what do we owe this population? And that's a question of historical and moral responsibility that people usually ask about, events between humans, right? Violence, dispossession, colonization, and such. But what do we owe this population that we have dispossessed and done damage to and done violence to? Do we have a moral debt to the southern resident orcas? Do we only have moral debts to human beings, or do we have a moral debt to southern resident orcas? This population that helped transform us so profoundly, but has paid such a steep price for our change, for our education. And although people usually look, just like they mistakenly look only to science and engineering to solve the climate crisis, which is a gigantic mistake, they also often look to science to solve these kinds of ecological questions, when I would say that, in fact, the humanities and history actually offers us extraordinary tools and guideposts on how to approach something like this. How do you find a path to healing and redemption in the face of a history like this, which is both horrifying but also transformative and uplifting, and how much we've changed? Now, the writing of this book certainly became that kind of journey for me, a transformative journey for me. and to make sense of and to find, I think, a degree of peace about my family's role in this. But I also did this, with others. In 2016, I convinced Ted Griffin, the man who had conducted all these captures, then in his early 80s, to travel with me to Miami to visit Tokate in the Miami Seaquarium. And to my surprise and delight, he did. What happened when this man who captured this orca at the time 46 years earlier came face to face with her for the first time after the passage of a lifetime? You'll have to read the book. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. That was fascinating, and it brings up, Bob Hunter and Greenpeace. We've talked about them. Last time Dr. Paul Spong was mentioned in a Historical Society lecture was about, this should be a quiz actually, it was about the Maplewood mudflats a few years ago, because he lived there. So one of those very interesting characters at that time. And I love the humanity, everything that comes through in this. Are there questions for our speaker tonight?
This is more of an observation than a question, because I was a docent at the Vancouver Aquarium for a number of years back in the late 80s and early 90s, and I remember just marveling at just how people's perceptions of these animals have changed so much in the period of 20 years, because I grew up in Vancouver and I was about 8, 9, 10 years of age, and people thought, oh, killer whales, they're like sharks, they're vicious. And to see that amazing change in perception just really came home to me when I was out there with the kids, taking them around and showing them the orcas.
Yeah. So you're talking about the more recent kind of redefinition of orca, not the Latin. Yeah, I mean, the etymology is contested, actually. I mean, some Latinists will tell you it means like a big scary barrel, and and some will tell you it means demon from the netherworld. The kind of, I think the popularization of that usage comes from Pliny the Elder's account of orcas, and that's what many have sort of quoted from natural scientists, and then that kind of became popularized. Like all cetaceans, there have been several different versions of names for orcas, but Orcinus orca eventually sort of caught on. What I was trying to get at with the sort of shifting use of it was to say rather that it's not that we've changed. It's not that we've decided to use a new term no one is using, but actually we changed the meaning of the term orca to reflect our different views, right? The term orca itself became less menacing. And that's really Paul Spong's doing. Like, he was very adamant that we shouldn't call them killer whales. We shouldn't call them killer whales. I tend to think that was actually a little bit superficial to assume that they were called killer whales because they were assumed to kill people, because it actually comes from the Portuguese and Spanish, right? Which means whale killers or killers of whales. But it's interesting to note that I think it's the only marine mammal that I know of, and maybe one of the only animals I know of, that people have sort of been urged to call by its scientific name or a portion of its scientific name. I tend to still use killer whale just because it's what scientists use, and I don't, in my head, have any negative connotations with it. But I do get shamed sometimes for that, because some people are, and the new phrasing that hits my ears really hard is orca whale, which you never heard before about 4 or 5 years ago, which is also kind of weird because scientists define them as dolphins, right? So orca whale is particularly strange, but hopefully I kind of touched a little bit of that, on a little bit of that answer for you. Yeah, he's the central character in Blackfish, and Blackfish is a really weird and confused documentary in lots of ways. I mean, it was really effective, but a lot of its early history that it tried to account was actually dead wrong. But what's interesting is that it uses Tilikum as a centerpiece, and it's weird because it's kind of conflicted. On the one hand, it sort of depicts orcas as this kind of, beloved animal that we now know we shouldn't keep in captivity, and but the kind of main argument of the documentary is they're too dangerous to keep in captivity, right? And there's all these sort of workplace safety things. But Tilikum was pretty unique in the sense that he was the only orca in history that in captivity that's ever killed somebody, and he actually killed 3 people. He was captured in Iceland. It wasn't any more traumatic than any other captures. It's just captures are traumatic, right? He was kept in a really awful situation in Sealand, which was a very undercapitalized, small, oceanarium. And eventually, when it closed, was sold to SeaWorld. And one of the reasons Sealand closes is because Tilikum and the 2 other females that were in the tank end up drowning. They never ate, but end up drowning a young trainer. It was actually a UVic student, Kelty Byrne. And then, it seems to be what happened to him, which is common in animal behavior. He's like, oh, we can do this. We can kill people. And actually, a homeless guy snuck in to SeaWorld and, decided it'd be fun to go swim with the orca and actually was killed and maimed by Tilikum. And then finally, of course, the last killing was of the trainer. But it's his story is kind of anomalous too, right? And so what's interesting is that documentary uses it as sort of the centerpiece, but he's pretty unique in his story. But not to blame him for becoming a serial murderer or anything, but his situation, he was quite brutalized, and you can see how that could happen. It's like a dog, becoming aggressive, right, by being beaten and such. Oh, that's in the news a lot lately. Yeah. This isn't super relevant to the southern residents or to the populations we mostly see here, but scientific research has sort of concluded in about the last 10, 12 years that not only are there indeed these very specialized ecotypes of orcas, and I guess I should have made this more clear. Orcas they're really fascinating because they have different food cultures all over the world, and they tend to be quite picky eaters. And the food cultures that they adopt actually drive their own evolution, meaning they are such xenophobes toward others that eat differently that that not only do they not intermingle, they don't interbreed, and so on. And so scientists have noted that in lots of ways their feeding habits drive them toward speciation, like splitting into different species is kind of what we're seeing because they don't interbreed. And so one of the populations that was discovered about 15 years ago and confirmed is the offshore orca population that sort of operates sort of off the coast from Oregon all the way up to Vancouver Island, and they tend to eat mostly sleeper sharks, deep sea sleeper sharks. But increasingly, there's also really good documentation of orcas predating on great white sharks, and sort of. You see this kind of behavior going after sort of sharks and their relatives sort of all around the world. New Zealand, there's a population, I've never figured out how they do this, but they attack stingrays and they never get stung, but they sort of attack stingrays and dig them up from the sand. But the thing that sharks have that are quite delicious apparently for orcas are their livers, right? All sharks have like gigantic livers. And so that's what they're going after. They're sort of ripping their livers out. And it's interesting, it does change our views a little bit of orcas. In the sense that they're going after often, more endangered creatures. Like sharks are pretty endangered around the world. Human beings in this area, we delight in our orcas because we can relate to them. They eat salmon. We love salmon. It's very different if you see them, eating a sea otter in front of you in Alaska, which they do. And so it's interesting how the food cultures themselves affect our perceptions, right? When you see an orca going after and throwing around a baby seal and sort of toying with it, we don't tend to think about them as sea pandas in the same way, right? Oh, yeah. That's actually really common for large predators, sort of slower, kind of less productive reproduction rates. And so, yeah, this is why it's so tragic when you lose a female in particular in this population, and because even a healthy female over their lifetime might give birth to 6 calves, and half of which might survive. And so the resilience of the population compared to, say, the other species I'm looking at a lot right now with their interaction with humans, gray whales, who are much more productive and sort of on a 2-year cycle, more resilient to those kind of pressures. The second point, yeah, Tahlequah, the southern resident mother, young mother whose calf died and she pushed around for a couple weeks. I know that one really well because I was doing a book tour for this. That was the summer of 2018, and things were kind of dying down. I did my few book talks, and that was great. And I went back to thought I was going back to my quiet life as a professor, and then that happened, and it was front page news around the world. And I did about 300 interviews and 100 public talks, for the next year and a half, and that event very much drove that. And so I would say it was a really powerful moment for people who hadn't thought about orcas very much, to think about animals in general as having emotions and bonds that we could relate to, that we're not unique in having grief, having bonds to our young ones. It was sort of a photo made for photo moment. Now, by no means would I say that her intention pushing her calf around was to guilt the humans of the Salish Sea, but that's precisely what happened, because human beings themselves tell stories about events and make sense of them. And for a lot of people, that was a moment of reflecting, I think, on what humans had done to the ecosystem. And the third one was, remind me. Oh yeah, I mean, yeah, I've been asked about that a lot by European reporters, actually. I'm like, what the hell's going on? Were you wrong about, or were we not supposed to love this predator? I mean, I think that it's a classic case of social learning. Orcas are incredibly proficient at this, and so and marine mammals are proficient at this. A dolphin that learns to water walk, to tail walk in an oceanarium and is released will actually teach wild relations, and friends. Hey, look at this great trick I learned, and they'll start doing it. Wild dolphins in Australia start doing the oceanarium tricks. Like, this is amazing. And I think that's probably, orcas learn these tricks, right, to grab, sablefish off of long lines in Alaska. They sort of learn it from each other. And if they start sort of playing with and going after and bonking into boats, they learn, hey, that's something we can do. And it's hard to tell whether they're intentionally being aggressive or whether this is just sort of playtime, right? But a lot of people, are telling the story. This is why I think it's interesting to think about animal agency in history, right? A lot of people have skeptically told me, yeah, but they don't know what they're doing and that they're trying to shape history. I'm like, yeah, like people. How many of us know what we're doing and why we do it and what historical impact we'll have? No, none of us. And so, animals do that too. And I think in this case, you're seeing them, taking on this behavior. Who knows what it means to them, but it's definitely making humans think, God, is this them saying we've fished enough? We've taken enough biomass from the sea. Now leave it to the creatures of the sea. No, of course, that's not literally the thesis of the orcas, I don't think, but this is the sense how humans are making sense of that.